Okay, hello, welcome back. How are you today, Sandy?
I'm great. I'm excited to be back. This is a lot of fun, and we're diving into a pretty cool subject today. So I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
Yeah, so today we're talking about something that I think is really important to explain the difference between the conditioned and magnetic masculinity, because we even it's something that I think, like everything, we each receive it differently or we perceive it differently. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to explain what's the difference between the two. And then maybe we can start with what are they? Like what are some of the things that might describe them for somebody to maybe be able to identify or even think about which one could they actually be?
Right. So, and I think, first of all, we're multidimensional beings. So we have lots of different layers and lots of different areas of our lives. So we might be in alignment in our work, but maybe not in our relationship, or we might be um, in alignment in our personal relationships, but not in our family relationships or not with our relationship with ourself. Um, so I agree with you that it's important that words don't really mean anything unless we agree upon their metaphorical usage. So the way I use the term conditioned masculinity and magnetic masculinity, conditioned masculinity is sort of a byproduct of the emotional dark ages that we're trying to evolve out of. So that conditioning is sort of what you were taught in childhood would have been approved of. It's also the conditioning from society, from television, from popular culture, from your particular religion, your particular country, could be your particular family dynamic. So basically, we know nowadays that love and belonging is the number one biological, neurological need of the human species, even above food and water. We need to feel love and belonging. But often in childhood, we confuse fitting in with love and belonging. So, for instance, if you were maybe a very quiet, artistic child who liked classical music and read, and maybe you were a boy who wanted to do ballet, and you grew up in a family of cattle ranchers who liked to go camping and quadding on the weekends, and thought that the type of music they preferred was the best type of music, and that only nerds sat with their head in a book or whatever it was. That's a fairly extreme example, but we sort of judge in childhood what parts of us or aspects of our multidimensional personality get approval and what ones get disapproval. And again, we confuse that fitting in with love and belonging. So, in order to fit in with our family, siblings, culture, television, school, religion, country, whatever different layers of fitting in we are exposed to, we create this self concept. Some people might call that the ego or your personality. And sometimes that's very authentic and aligned. But more often than not, we have aspects in that who we think we needed to become to fit in that aren't actually authentically aligned for us. Or we're missing aspects of our personality, or we ourselves have rejected and disidentified and shamed the parts of ourselves, the aspects of our personality that don't fit into what we perceived we needed to be to fit in. So then it becomes the love and belonging that we seek, in my experience, needs to begin within those aspects of our authentic self. So if we're in our conditioned self, it's very exhausting to be inauthentic and you don't maybe feel fulfilled. So I think we have a graphic that will pop on the screen here. You can see here are aspects of conditioned masculinity, and here are aspects of authentic alignment or magnetic masculinity, as I call it. So when we're in our conditioned self, we might be tired, cranky, anxious, feel misunderstood, feel unfulfilled. Like a lot of men tell me they've checked all the boxes. Family, check. Education, check. $1 million in the bank, check. Nice car, check. Nice house, check. You know, check, check, check. But they still don't feel fulfilled. And that can be an indicator or a KPI that they are not living in their authentic alignment. They're living in that who they think they should be in order to fit in, at the expense of abandoning or not fitting in with themselves and their authentic desires. Does that make sense?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to ask, with what you said about that, maybe like growing up, we maybe unconsciously mistake getting like approval and fitting in with like love and belonging. Can you maybe give an example of like one situation where there's like an example of situation in which kind of result could be, oh, I'm fitting in, and which one would be love and belonging?
That's a good question. Okay, I'll give a couple of examples and tell me if that answers your question. For instance, if we had one child and that child grew up in a family where you had to be number one, and how you got approval from your parents was by being the best. Any part of you that was not the best or that wasn't achieving, you would develop shame around, because shame is the barrier to love and belonging. Shame is the I am bad or wrong or broken. So that child or human might only approve of themselves or feel like they fit in when they are number one or performing. That same child, if they grew up in a family that maybe said things like, don't be a show off, don't think you're better than everybody else, be humble, they might underperform because how they would fit in was by not standing out. And anytime they stood out, they might feel ashamed or shut down, or feel that part of them, that maybe their authentic self wants to shine and wants to be the center of attention or wants to be amazing at something and wants to be recognized. But because that behavior would have gotten them disapproval, they would suppress that natural, authentic alignment for themselves. Whereas that first child maybe wanted to be sort of like a supporting character and wanted to support other people, or kind of was an introvert and didn't want to stand out and didn't necessarily feel the need for that attention and being number one. So, or for instance, when I was a child and I was intellectually exceptional, I got a lot of pushback from my peers if I was reading or performing at grades above the rest of the class. I might get called a smarty pants or a show off, or as an empath, I would notice it made other people feel bad. So I would suppress and try to dull myself and try to fit in and not show any exceptionality because I wanted to fit in. But I did that at the expense of my own authentic alignment. Does that answer your question?
Where do we learn to, or at what point do we learn to distinguish them? Because it seems like it's a kind of approval means love and belonging, but at what point do we start to distinguish them, or what helps to distinguish them? Because even like one of the things that I wrote down that I also wanted to ask you is, where is that conditioned masculinity coming from? Is it coming from external, of something that we learn from others, or it's maybe something that, let's say we make ourselves small and we see that, oh, this is actually working, so I'm not seen, and we check that, but it's kind of also internal process of making that kind of connection. So where is it? Is it like external? Is it internal? Or like, where is it even coming from that we associate fitting in with that love and belonging?
That's a great question. I think it's probably a little bit of A and a little bit of B. So if we do get an overt disapproval or punishment from our parents or from our peers or somewhere in society, say you're very dramatic or very emotional and you get punished for that, then you would maybe suppress that part of yourself. Or you could just make assumptions about what other people think or want by observing other people and misinterpreting their signals as being always about you, and you could draw a conclusion. Like a lot of our thinking in childhood, our brains are still developing, and because a lot of us are not necessarily taught emotional intelligence or taught, I mean, some are for sure, but definitely when I was a child, it was maybe less common than it is now, which I think is an evolutionary win for humanity. I think we're always growing and expanding. So I think it could be from an external punishment or external feedback, or it could just be from an internal conclusion. I remember in childhood once deciding that other children didn't like me because I was unlovable. Nobody told me I was unlovable, but I remember thinking there must be something wrong with me because the other children don't really like me. I don't think about the same things they think about. I don't talk about the same things they talk about. Therefore, I must be not good because I don't fit in. Now, it could be from external feedback because I also remember being severely bullied. I remember being told things like, you're stupid and you're ugly. And I believed those words like they were the gospel. Like I was like, oh, even though I had all of this evidence that I was intellectually gifted and I had a lot of capacity to learn, I believed, because I had that emotional reaction of shame and not fitting in, I believed that I was stupid and I believed that I was ugly. So it didn't matter what I looked like. It didn't matter how I performed. I had those beliefs. So it could be something that we conclude internally, or it could be something we believe externally, or it could be a combination of the above, I think.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So like with that conditioned masculinity, how does it affect us going through life? Whether it's like, maybe you can touch on two things. One is like our like personal lives, but maybe also relationships as well. How would that look like?
Well, I'm not in conditioned masculinity because I'm a cis female, but but I've definitely, for men, they have this other layer of societal expectation. And again, I acknowledge that there are different cultures and different countries, so I'm probably speaking a little bit with a North American bias. But generally, boys are taught to be tough, don't cry, don't be a sissy, be strong, man up. Be the provider. You have to perform. You have to be good at sports, or you have to be good at academics, or you're going to be the lawyer like your father was, or you're going to be an accountant, or you're going to be a plumber, or you're going to never amount to anything, or you're like your family, or you're going to be a truck driver because we were all truck drivers, or whatever it is. There's this sort of, I heard a metaphor once that if emotions were like crayons and different crayons were like different colors of crayons were like different emotions. In childhood, girls get a box of crayons to play with that are acceptable, that we can color with. And boys are given like one or two crayons, and that's it. So it's like or the other metaphor I use is that it's like we've cut off men's emotional legs in childhood, and then we put them in relationships or put them in positions of power. And we're like, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you walk up the stairs? Well, they can't because they don't have any legs. So they've been taught this conditioning in childhood of what got them approval and what helped them fit in and what did not, that they have this sort of personal as well as collective and probably epigenetic expectation of what it means to be a man. And that might happen to align with their authentic alignment and magnetic masculinity, but in most cases, there's at least layers or aspects that authentically don't line up with the narrative that they were conditioned in childhood, or that conditioned masculinity. That we're also looking at the fact that there is no one definition for masculinity. That's why I prefer authentic alignment or magnetic masculinity, because what is masculinity to one man is completely different to somebody else. So I think that magnetic masculinity is authentic alignment, if that makes sense, and
It's
whatever
actually
that looks like.
it's actually one of the things that I wanted to ask you, what does masculinity look like? Because for me, it was similar with femininity. Because like I would associate it with like looking girly. And my friend said that she wants to work on her femininity. And I was like, what do you mean? Like you are feminine. And that's when I start to understand that what I my whole life would perceive as like feminine, it was really in a way just one prism of like what's actually like what it actually entails.
Yeah.
So maybe you can give some ideas of what maybe some, let's say one person might think that this is masculinity, but what else does it entail?
Oh, that's a good question. So again, I would like to acknowledge the irony that I am a cis straight female who is teaching men about masculinity. I would like to acknowledge the irony of that. I'm not blind to that. However, again, I think masculinity, there are sort of qualities inherent in the divine masculine, which again exists. We all have the capacity for the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And like a man who's like you're very like very old school, super macho, super tough, super shut down masculinity could potentially be authentically aligned, but is often an underdevelopment of some of the more softer skills that allow them to balance the human experience a little more and experience more love and belonging and connection with themselves and others. And masculinity could look like the example that we gave earlier of a very soft-spoken gentleman who enjoys ballet and classical music and quietly reading, and that could be authentically aligned. I've also met a lot of men who are very sensitive and empaths and sort of don't fit into that classic masculine mold, but some of them do also want to work on their divine masculine aspects and developing, not becoming inauthentic, but just finding that balance of those polarities that we all have, with the acceptance of which ones are authentically sort of dominant for us. So whether you're on the female or trans or non-binary or masculine spectrum, wherever you are on any of those is valid. I think it's more about celebrating, again, that authentic alignment, because somebody who is authentically aligned, who's really actually like, this is who I am and this is what I love, they are confident, they have clarity, they have emotional mastery, skillful communicators, they exude energy, they're inspired, they're inspiring to others. And people, when they're like that, they don't tend to hurt other people. They're more accepting of others because they're more accepting of themselves. They're not as critical of themselves, so they're not as critical of others. They're not stuck in forcing themselves to fit in a box, so they're not judging other people for not being in a box. So I think that one of the biggest goals for humanity for decades, I thought, was enlightenment, but I actually think enlightenment's kind of a ridiculous goal on some levels.
How comes?
It's more of an ego goal. I think a more helpful goal for humanity is authentic alignment and authenticity. Like,
Can you explain why you got to this conclusion? Or like, because I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts behind it, because I think it's enlightenment. It's something that's really kind of promoted and you hear a lot about it. You don't hear
yeah,
as much maybe about alignment because it seems like, oh, it's like a step down maybe.
yes, yes, but that thought itself is coming from the trying to fit in or trying to be good enough or trying to be better than or trying to be the best, which again, everything has a shadow and a light. Everything has a polarity or a pendulum swing. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to be the best. If you're like, when I was a photographer, I would spend sometimes 14 hours a day practicing, not because I wanted to be better than anybody, but because I wanted to do my best, not from a place of I'm not good enough, but from a place of authentic alignment and expression of my full creativity. So again, it's sometimes the energy behind an action more than the action. And often the energy behind enlightenment is I want to be the best, or I'm not good enough, or then I will be done with this planet, or I think that, and it's just an easy place for the ego to kind of get a hold of. Whereas if we're just making self-compassion and authentic alignment and authenticity the goal, and living our best, most fulfilling life the goal, the outcome of that could be what we might refer to as enlightenment.
So there's like different maybe that like reasoning behind it, or that sense behind it of how you get there. So alignment, or in what's the word, and enlightenment. So that can be more like ego driven, or it's just like kind of what you get after you have got to that authentic alignment, but it's more so.
It could be more of I think it's more helpful. I think it's more helpful to make what we might call enlightenment a consequence rather than a goal. Because, and by the time you're in authentic alignment and you are happy and fulfilled and self-accepting and self-aware, actually, yes, if we had to make two goals in humanity, authentic alignment and self-awareness, and authenticity would be like your, sort of great goals, because when you're in those, you don't actually care if you're enlightened, or if you're just so happy and fulfilled and energized that you're like, I have everything I want and need. And then that next level of evolution, or that higher level of consciousness or enlightenment, can become a consequence of it, but you don't really care about it anymore because you're just so fulfilled and happy. And then that's what you're projecting onto others, right? So we're always using others as a mirror. So when we're incredibly critical of ourselves, we tend to be critical of others. When we're terrified of people judging us, we tend to judge others. We call that blind spots. Blind spots, or sometimes people call blind spots in corporate coaching would be called blind spots. And in modern spirituality and self-help, it might be called shadow work.
It's interesting. So like
but
that
finding those parts of ourselves that we don't identify with because we think they're bad or wrong, or they don't fit in. And then it doesn't mean that we don't have them. It just means we become blind to them because we can't look at any part of our conditioning that doesn't fit the version of ourselves that we think is worthy of love and belonging. Whereas if we celebrate authenticity, celebrate self-awareness, celebrate authentic alignment, then, we all, I don't know, we all just kind of have more fun and are happier. And when we have a lot of self-compassion and a lot of acknowledgement of our less evolved conditioned behaviors that no longer serve us, and we seek those out with curiosity and compassion, then we will project or mirror that onto others. And then we'll recognize when they're behaving in suboptimal ways, we'll say, oh yeah, I've done it, or I can imagine why I would do that. Or it just creates more connection and compassion and the love and belonging rather than the fitting in, which is not actually fulfilling. If you look around in society, fitting in is not fulfilling. People aren't happy. I mean, I'm not saying nobody's happy. I'm not speaking for the entirety of humanity, but fitting in doesn't necessarily mean happiness, whereas love and belonging does. But love and belonging requires authenticity, because otherwise it's not you that's love and belonging, it's your self-concept, at the expense of you then not having love and belonging within those parts of yourself. So at one point, I came to that conclusion when I was experiencing one of my bouts with depression. And I've had sort of biological depression from chemicals and malfunctioning brain chemistry. This one was more of an emotional variety of depression, where I realized that I had contorted myself so much to fit in And I kept thinking, well, if I just get these people around me to accept me, or if I have this love and belonging, I will be fine. But I wasn't, because that love and belonging needs to exist within yourself first. And if you're denying or rejecting or disidentifying from your authentic parts in order to fit in, then that separation, that loneliness, right? If love and belonging is the number one need of the human species, the absence of that would be loneliness, which is why loneliness is so painful. And shame is the barrier between the two, which we'll probably talk about in another episode, because that's that's a whole subject too. So if we have that loneliness and that separation from our authentic parts that we've like, oh, no, I'm not smart. Oh, no, I'm not overly feminine. Oh, no, I'm tough. Oh, no, I'm this, I'm that. And we disidentified with those authentic parts in favor of our conditioning to fit in, then that loneliness, it's like that kind of loneliness that you feel even when you're in a room full of people or laying beside your partner in bed at night, and you still feel kind of lonely and unfulfilled. And I spent years just pondering this and thinking about it and looking at different parts of myself. And I realized that that loneliness was coming from this separation from my authenticity.
So what would you say are some of the challenges that people might face when it comes to getting into that alignment or that authenticity, moving from that conditioned?
Well, it depends how you frame it. So I try to frame it as like a fun journey, like dating yourself and trying to sort of work out which parts of you are authentic, which parts of you are conditioning or coping mechanisms, which parts of you were sort of developed in childhood to fit in or to serve a purpose. I mean, there's other layers to this too, which is if you're, so your needs as a human being must and deserve to be met, healthy needs. And when we're in our authentic alignment, we have needs like belonging, acceptance, appreciation, acknowledgement, admiration, whatever it is, whatever our authentic needs are. If you don't know who your authentic self is, how can you possibly assess what your authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are? Because if your life is lined up to fill your authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values, your life is fulfilling and fun. So I often tell people it's like working for a corporation or being a hiring manager, maybe. And if you're hiring somebody who's a super outgoing alpha sales type person, and you're putting them in an accounting role where they're going to do spreadsheets all day, but when what you really needed was an HR director, you know, things just aren't going to fit well. And that's often what we do to parts of ourselves, again, in order to fit in or be that as a result of the conditioning.
So is that like the blind spots that we have?
Sometimes, yes. So blind spots themselves should be an episode, because blind spots can just be, oh, I didn't think I was that way. Or blind spots can be the ways that we have learned. Again, like I said, needs must be met. So we either meet our needs or we find strategies to manipulate to get our needs met. Like people who like are seeking compliments, for example. Have you ever met somebody? I've done it for sure. I always speak with a mirror, not a measuring stick, where you start finding yourself fishing for compliments or buying something for somebody and then being like, did you like it? Did you like it? Did you like it? How much did you like it? Did you like that thing I buy you? And we find these ways to sort of like fill those needs that we may not be aware of that we have. Another way that blind spots come in is that if we don't get our needs met in childhood, or we don't know what our authentic needs are, we might develop protector personalities or ways of coping that are unbehooving of our most delightful selves. So blind spots can also be, have you ever heard the expression, the pot calling the kettle black? So you'll hear somebody who's like, I can't stand gossipy people, like that's so-and-so. She is the most gossipy, whatever. I can't stand her. And when she starts talking to whoever or whatever it is, and you think, well, you're probably the most gossipy person I know. But they're like, I can't stand gossipy people, or I can't stand people that interrupt all the time. And you're like, but you interrupt all the time. So blind spots can also be the parts of our personality that we would be ashamed of. So instead, we judge them or mirror them in others. So we can also, one of the ways that we can, there's many ways, and I have like sort of processes to help people make this transition. But one of the things I tell people is look at what you worship in others and look at what you loathe in others. And that'll kind of help you own your awesome and own your shit. So if you're, you know, it's often why people get celebrity crushes, or, you know, you look at somebody, you're like, wow, they're so confident, or they're so successful, or they're so creative, or they're so wealthy, or they're so something, that it's that part of ourselves that we have rejected that's seeing itself and desiring its own alignment. The same as we can look in others and we are like, oh, I can't stand people that talk too much or interrupt or whatever it is, that either is something that we ourselves do that we're blind to, or something that our parents or our church or our culture or our country would have disapproved of in childhood. Therefore, we're like, yes, that thing is bad, that thing is wrong, that thing does not fit in. So we also get this sort of binary thinking of good, bad, right, wrong, what fits, what helps me fit in, what doesn't. And that adds to that conditioning of judging everything as good or bad, right or wrong, from the lens of, is this thing helping me fit in? And in order to fit in, I have to be good. I have to be the best, or I can't be the best, or I have to be feminine, or I can't be feminine, or I have to be masculine, or I can't be masculine, or I have to this, I can't do that. And that all sort of, all of those layers into our conditioning, which contributes to our blind spots, which are sometimes our most amazing aspects. It's not only our shadows or our protector personalities and coping mechanisms. Sometimes those blind spots are like the most beautiful aspects of ourselves.
So is it like we create these rules of what we can and can't be instead of just being, in a way?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we create this self-concept. And again, for men, this can be even more prominent because we are emotional beings, and love and belonging itself requires emotional awareness. And emotional intelligence, at least when and where I grew up, was not prioritized as much as academic performance. And that was exponentially more for the boys and the men. So their blind spots can be sometimes bigger, not always, sometimes can be bigger. And what they were allowed to be, what color of crayons they were allowed to color with, or what aspects were allowed to be in this self-concept that would allow them to fit in, was actually, in my opinion, sometimes more narrow.
Yeah, interesting. I feel like we covered.
Not that it's a comparison, because women were also put in boxes. We're supposed to be mothers and wives, and we're supposed to do this, and we're supposed to do that. So I acknowledge that. I'm all for the rise of the divine feminine as well. And just like I always say, I don't think it has to be at the expense of any gender or any anywhere on that spectrum.
Yeah, it's really interesting also to see how we have, each gender has kind of different those rules that you have to follow, or that you learn that you need to follow. Yeah. So I feel like we covered so many things. It's been is there anything else that you maybe would want to leave listeners with, or something that you would want to add to all the things that we already discussed when it comes to these topics?
Curious about yourself. Just be curious. Just start asking yourself, you know, for instance, I used to really reject anything super feminine or super romantic because I was in a very feminist household. And I made that mean that anything super feminine was weak or unacceptable. So just be curious about yourself. Be curious about the things you look at in others and go, ugh, gross. Like I would look at women and be like, oh, she is so weak, or she is so cheesy. I don't love that stuff. But my authentic self actually loves that stuff. And I do also value my strength and my independence and those things, but those are both aspects of my personality. It's just that one I always denied. So just be curious about yourself. Start observing what you worship and look up to in others and what you really despise in others, or what really triggers or activates or annoys you in others. Ask really honest but loving people in your life. This is pretty advanced stuff. A lot of people, if they still have a lot of shame, are not able to do this yet, which is valid. You can ask people, like, what are the things that I don't know about myself? Like, what are my blind spots? What are kind of like what are my lousy aspects? And then approach them with a sense of humor and a lot of compassion, and congratulate yourself for being brave enough to look at some of these coping mechanisms that are less adorable. And really start to be curious about what are your wants, needs, boundaries, and values. Not the wants, needs, boundaries, and values of your self-concept, but what actually lights you up. Because again, if you don't know what your authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are, how can you possibly assess the different areas of your life to see if they are or are not in authentic alignment with what's going to light you up and help you create your most magnetic life?
Are there some questions that somebody can answer to get those answers?
Yes, I actually have a workbook that I created that's called I call it the Authentic Alignment Workbook. So aside from the questions that I just started with, I have a whole workbook of questions such as, what were you punished for in childhood? What were you praised for in childhood? What things really trigger you or piss you off in others? So I have a questionnaire when people book an initial strategy session with me. And my goal in those sessions is to provide as much value as possible. So I have a questionnaire that allows me to sort of start cutting through and identifying patterns, because it's hard to see what's in our subconscious by the very nature of it being subconscious. And they say 90 to 95% of our perceptual awareness, it's commonly said in self-help, is subconscious. So I have created these workbooks and these different frameworks over the years and decades that allow me to sort of start helping people get in there a lot quicker, and with a loving, compassionate, but honest and direct sort of reflection and mirror back, and asking the hard questions. So somebody could maybe book a strategy session with me, and if we work together, or they join my one of my programs, like the Multidimensional Man or Evolutionary Mastery for the Modern Man or Magnetic Masculinity, then I do have some workbooks and tools that help us sort of go through that sometimes fun process more quickly and effectively, so that we can spend more of our time in that authentic alignment.
All right. Well, thank you everybody listening. And we also going to leave place where you can ask any questions or anything you want to ask, so that we can bring them up and Sandy can answer them all.
Yes, my former assistant used to say I was like taking a sip from a fire hose. So if I gave a fire hose of information today, I apologize. And please feel free to ask any questions. I'm always open to answering questions. I'm always open to being wrong. And I assume that there's a lot of perspectives that I missed there that would help people have context. Or if something was confusing, or something you just wanted to challenge something, please let us know, because I absolutely love answering questions. And I assume that there are things that I could have said today that would have added context and help that I missed. So yeah, definitely feel free to send us any questions.
All right. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.